Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
Standing in my family's driveway at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, holding 2 trash bags filled with my belongings, I finally understood what 23 years of being the family scapegoat had led to. My father had just suspended me from our home until I apologized to my sister Madison for exposing her lies about cheating on her college entrance exams. The porch light cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of our suburban Connecticut house, and I could see Madison watching from her bedroom window with that smug smile I knew so well. When Dad demanded I say I was sorry for trying to sabotage Madison's future, I looked him straight in the eye and said, "All right." He thought he'd won. He had no idea those 2 words would trigger a chain reaction that would destroy everything they'd built on lies and favoritism. The events that led to my so-called suspension started 3 weeks earlier when I accidentally walked into Madison's room looking for my laptop charger. She was hunched over her computer, and I caught a glimpse of what looked like test preparation materials, but something seemed off. The name on the screen wasn't hers. When I asked about it, she slammed the laptop shut and told me to mind my own business. That night, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to dig a little deeper. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Madison had been paying someone named Jessica Chen to take her SAT exams using fake identification. I found email exchanges, payment receipts through Venmo, and even photos of the fake ID Madison had created with Jessica's picture, but Madison's personal information. The scheme was elaborate and had been going on for months. Madison's perfect 1600 SAT score, the one that got her into Harvard with a full scholarship, was completely fraudulent. I confronted Madison privately the next morning, hoping she'd come clean to our parents herself. Instead, she laughed in my face and told me nobody would believe me anyway. She reminded me how our parents had always chosen her side in every conflict we'd ever had, from childhood squabbles to serious issues. She was right, and we both knew it. Growing up, I'd watched Madison get away with everything while I took the blame for things I didn't even do. When we were 12 and 14, Madison stole $200 from Mom's purse to buy designer jeans. When the money was discovered missing, Madison claimed I'd been acting suspicious lately, and suddenly I was grounded for 3 weeks despite having an alibi. When Madison crashed Dad's car during her senior year of high school because she was driving drunk, the family story became that she swerved to avoid a deer. The insurance company bought it, and Madison walked away without consequences while I was lectured about being more supportive of my sister during her traumatic experience. The pattern continued into our adult lives. Madison's plagiarized valedictorian speech was celebrated as brilliant, even though I recognized entire paragraphs from famous historical addresses. Her fake volunteer work at a homeless shelter that didn't exist somehow made it onto every college application. When she got caught shoplifting $300 worth of makeup from Sephora, Mom and Dad hired a lawyer and blamed it on peer pressure and college stress. Meanwhile, my achievements went unnoticed or were downplayed. When I graduated summa cum laude from State University, Dad's only comment was that Madison would probably do even better at Harvard. When I landed a great job at a marketing firm right after graduation, the family dinner conversation focused on Madison's latest sorority social event. I'd learned to expect nothing and was rarely disappointed. But the SAT fraud was different. This wasn't just family favoritism or turning a blind eye to minor infractions. This was criminal fraud that could destroy other students' opportunities and make a mockery of the entire college admissions process. I couldn't stay silent about something this serious. When I finally worked up the courage to present the evidence to our parents, I thought surely they'd have to listen. I'd printed out emails, transaction records, and even found the contact information for the person Madison had hired. I laid everything out on the kitchen table during Sunday dinner and waited for their response. Madison didn't miss a beat. Before I could even finish explaining what I'd discovered, she burst into tears and accused me of being jealous of her success. She claimed I'd always resented her for being smarter and more popular, and now I was trying to sabotage her Harvard acceptance out of spite. She said I'd probably fabricated the evidence somehow, maybe even hacked into her accounts to frame her. Dad's reaction was swift and predictable. He swept all my evidence into a pile without even looking at it, and told me I was out of line for invading Madison's privacy. He said he was disgusted by my jealousy, and that I should be ashamed of myself for trying to tear down my own sister. Mom sat silently through the entire confrontation, occasionally nodding along with Dad's accusations but never speaking up to defend me or even ask to see the evidence. The argument escalated when I insisted the evidence was real and begged them to just look at it objectively. Dad accused me of being manipulative and suggested I needed professional help for my obvious psychological issues. Madison played her part perfectly, sobbing about how hurt she was that her own brother would try to destroy her future. She even managed to work in a comment about how she'd always tried to be supportive of me despite my obvious mental health problems. That's when Dad delivered his ultimatum. He told me I had 24 hours to apologize to Madison for my accusations and false evidence, or I could find somewhere else to live. He called it a suspension from the family home, as if I were a misbehaving teenager, instead of a 23-year-old college graduate who'd been contributing to household expenses for over a year. Standing in that driveway with my belongings in trash bags, I realized this moment had been inevitable. 23 years of watching Madison get away with everything while I was blamed for problems I didn't create had led to this point. But as I looked at my father's self-righteous expression and Madison's triumphant smirk, I also realized something else. I wasn't the same powerless kid who'd taken the blame for Madison's stolen money all those years ago. I had been secretly documenting Madison's lies and manipulations for the past 2 years, ever since I'd started to understand that the family dynamic would never change on its own. I had photos, recordings, financial records, and witness statements that painted a clear picture of Madison's true character. What my parents didn't know was that I'd been building a case, not out of spite or jealousy, but because I'd finally accepted that someday I might need to protect myself from their gaslighting and manipulation. That night in the garage, I wasn't packing clothes or personal items. I was organizing 2 years' worth of carefully collected evidence and making the phone calls that would change everything. My laptop was open on Dad's workbench, and I was systematically uploading files to secure cloud storage accounts my family didn't know existed. The College Board's fraud hotline was my first call. I'd researched the process weeks earlier, knowing this day might come. The representative who answered was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about the nature of the fraud and what evidence I could provide. I walked her through Madison's scheme, from the initial contact with Jessica Chen to the fake identification documents and payment records. She gave me a case number and explained that their investigation team would be in touch within 48 hours. Harvard's admissions fraud department was equally professional when I called their emergency line. I provided them with Madison's student identification number, application details, and a comprehensive summary of the fraudulent test scores and fabricated application materials. The admissions counselor assured me that they took fraud allegations very seriously and would begin their investigation immediately. But the most important call was to my uncle Ryan, my father's younger brother who'd been cut out of the family circle 3 years earlier for what Dad called causing unnecessary drama. The real reason Ryan had been banished was much simpler. He'd called out my parents' treatment of me during a particularly ugly Thanksgiving dinner when I was 20. Ryan had watched Dad berate me for getting a B+ in organic chemistry, while praising Madison's C- in remedial math, and he'd finally spoken up. The argument that followed led to Ryan being uninvited from all future family gatherings. Ryan answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. When I explained my situation, he was quiet for a long moment before saying he'd been waiting for this call for 3 years. He told me he'd watched my parents' favoritism destroy my self-esteem throughout my childhood and had always hoped I'd eventually find the strength to walk away. He offered me his guest room indefinitely and promised that my parents would get no information about my whereabouts if I chose to stay with him. As we talked, Ryan shared perspectives on our family dynamic that I'd never heard before. He told me that Dad's favoritism toward Madison reminded him of how their own father had treated Dad's older sister, creating a cycle of dysfunction that had damaged multiple generations. He explained that Mom's silence wasn't just weakness, but a learned survival mechanism from her own chaotic childhood. Understanding the patterns, didn't excuse their behavior, but it helped me realize that their treatment of me was about their own psychological damage, not any failing on my part. With my living situation secured, I turned to financial preparations. I'd been secretly saving money from my marketing job for over a year, keeping funds in an account my parents didn't know about. I'd learned to be secretive about my finances after Dad had borrowed money from my high school graduation gifts without asking and never paid it back. What I discovered when I logged into my main savings account made my blood run cold. My college fund, which should have contained nearly $15,000 from part-time jobs and careful saving, was down to less than $3,000. Bank records showed a series of withdrawals over the past 18 months, all authorized by my father, who was listed as a joint account holder from when I'd opened the account as a minor. The money had been systematically drained to pay for Madison's expensive test preparation courses, private tutoring sessions, and college application consulting fees. Dad had been stealing from me for over a year to fund Madison's fraudulent college preparation, and I'd never noticed because I trusted him to respect my savings. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Madison had done, because it showed how far my parents were willing to go to support her at my expense. They weren't just turning a blind eye to her behavior anymore. They were actively enabling it with my own money. I immediately transferred the remaining funds to my private account and closed the joint account. Then I spent the rest of the night organizing evidence files and creating detailed timelines of Madison's fraudulent activities. By dawn, I had everything uploaded to multiple secure locations and had prepared comprehensive reports for both the College Board and Harvard. My departure note was simple and direct. You got your wish. I apologized to Madison. I'm sorry she's not the person you think she is. I left it on the kitchen table, next to a printed summary of the evidence I'd submitted to the authorities, knowing they'd find it when they came downstairs for breakfast. As I loaded my car in the pre-dawn darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based on what was right rather than what would keep the peace. The scared, guilty kid who'd always apologized for things he didn't do was finally gone. I drove to Ryan's house as the sun came up, watching my childhood neighborhood disappear in the rearview mirror. His modest colonial in the next town over felt more like home in the first 5 minutes than our house had in years. Ryan made coffee and scrambled eggs while I unpacked my few belongings, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe normally. Ryan's guest room was small but comfortable, with a desk where I could set up my laptop and continue working remotely for my marketing firm. My boss had been understanding when I'd explained I was dealing with a family emergency and needed to work from a different location temporarily. Having a stable job and income gave me independence my parents had never expected me to achieve so young. Around 10 that morning, Ryan's phone started ringing. Dad had apparently discovered my note and was demanding information about my whereabouts. Ryan calmly told him that I was safe, but that he wouldn't be sharing any details about my location or plans. When Dad threatened to call the police, Ryan reminded him that I was a 23-year-old adult who had every right to leave home without permission. The calls escalated throughout the morning, with both my parents trying different approaches to get information from Ryan. Mom tried guilt, claiming she was worried sick and just wanted to know I was okay. Dad alternated between threats and bargaining, even offering to forgive my accusations against Madison if I'd just come home and apologize properly. Ryan handled each call with calm professionalism, never giving them any information while making it clear that their attempts at manipulation weren't working. At 11:15, the first official call came. The College Board's investigation team contacted my parents' house, requesting an immediate interview with Madison regarding allegations of testing fraud. According to Ryan, who was still receiving frantic calls from Dad, the investigator was polite but firm about the seriousness of the allegations and the strength of the evidence they'd received. Harvard's call came an hour later. The admissions office informed my parents that Madison's acceptance was being placed under immediate review due to fraud allegations, and that her scholarship funds would be frozen pending the outcome of their investigation. They requested copies of all her application materials and official test scores, and informed the family that any attempt to interfere with the investigation would result in automatic dismissal and potential legal action. By early afternoon, my phone was flooded with blocked calls from numbers I recognized as my family's. I'd changed my settings to send all their calls directly to voicemail, but the frequency of attempts told me they were getting desperate. The few messages I listened to ranged from Dad's angry demands that I call him immediately to Madison's tearful claims that I was ruining her life over nothing. But the most telling message came from Mom, who had rarely called me directly in recent years. Her voice was shaky and uncertain, as she said, "Barrett, I know you're angry with us, but please call me back. There are things I need to tell you about Madison that I should have said years ago. I know you have every right to hate me, but please just give me a chance to explain." That evening, Ryan and I sat on his back porch while he shared more family history I'd never heard. He told me that Dad's relationship with Madison reminded him uncomfortably of their own father's obsession with appearances and social status. Ryan explained that Dad had always been insecure about his place in the world, and Madison's achievements, real or fabricated, made him feel successful as a parent in ways that my quieter accomplishments never had. Ryan also shared that Mom had called him privately several times over the years, expressing guilt about how I was being treated, but feeling powerless to change the family dynamic. She'd apparently asked Ryan's advice about standing up to Dad, but had always been too afraid of the consequences to follow through. Learning that Mom had been aware of the problem but chosen to stay silent was almost worse than thinking she'd been oblivious. As we talked, Ryan helped me understand that my decision to leave wasn't about punishing my family or destroying Madison's future. It was about refusing to participate in a system of lies and favoritism that had been damaging all of us for years. Madison's fraud wasn't just about getting into Harvard. It was the inevitable result of a lifetime of learning that rules didn't apply to her and that someone else would always clean up her messes. The next morning brought news that the investigation was expanding. The College Board had discovered that Madison's fraud wasn't limited to the SATs. Her PSAT scores, AP exam results, and even her driver's license test had all been taken by other people using fraudulent identification. The scope of her deception was far broader than I'd initially realized, suggesting a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years. But the real shock came when Mom finally worked up the courage to call Ryan directly. Through tears, she admitted that she'd known about Madison's cheating for months, but had been too afraid to say anything. She revealed that Madison had been blackmailing her with threats of self-harm if she didn't keep quiet, and that Dad had made it clear that questioning Madison's achievements would not be tolerated in their house. Mom's confession opened the floodgates. She told Ryan that Madison had never actually volunteered at the homeless shelter listed on her college applications. The leadership positions she'd claimed in high school clubs were fabricated. Even her part-time job at a local boutique was a lie. The owner was a family friend who'd agreed to provide fake employment verification in exchange for Dad's help with some legal issues. The perfect daughter my parents had been so proud of was built entirely on lies, and Mom had been keeping the secret to protect what she thought was Madison's mental health. But her admission to Ryan made it clear that Madison's threats and manipulation had extended far beyond just test scores. She'd been systematically deceiving everyone, including colleges, employers, and even mental health professionals who'd been trying to help her. Within a week, the fraud investigation had expanded into a full-scale inquiry involving multiple institutions and law enforcement agencies. Harvard had withdrawn Madison's acceptance and was demanding repayment of the scholarship funds that had already been distributed for housing and meal plans. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office had opened a criminal investigation into the testing fraud ring that Madison had been part of, and federal investigators were looking into possible mail fraud and wire fraud charges related to her college applications. The evidence I'd provided had been more comprehensive than I'd realized. Madison's scheme involved not just fake test scores, but fabricated transcripts, forged recommendation letters, and completely fictional volunteer activities. She'd created an elaborate web of lies that extended across multiple years and involved several other students who were now facing their own investigations. Jessica Chen, the woman Madison had hired to take her tests, had been arrested and was cooperating with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed that Madison had been part of a larger network of affluent students who were buying their way into prestigious universities through systematic fraud. The investigation was uncovering corruption that went far beyond just my sister's individual crimes. Meanwhile, my family's carefully constructed public image was crumbling in spectacular fashion. Dad's contracting business, which relied heavily on relationships and reputation in our affluent community, began losing clients as word of the scandal spread. The local newspaper picked up the story when Harvard's fraud investigation became public record, and suddenly the Morrison family name was associated with corruption and deception rather than success and respectability. But the financial devastation was just beginning. As investigators dug deeper into Madison's activities, they uncovered evidence that Dad had been systematically embezzling money from his own business to fund her lifestyle and fraudulent activities. The expensive test preparation courses, private tutoring, college consulting fees, and even Madison's designer clothes and luxury car had all been paid for with money that belonged to his business partners and clients. Ryan received a call from Mom explaining that federal agents had seized Dad's business records and frozen several bank accounts pending a financial crimes investigation. The family's assets, including their house and cars, were being evaluated to determine what had been purchased with stolen money. Mom was facing the possibility of losing everything, even though she claimed to have been unaware of Dad's embezzlement. The revelation about Dad's financial crimes hit me harder than Madison's academic fraud. I'd always known my parents played favorites, but learning that Dad had been stealing money to support Madison's lies while draining my college fund showed a level of betrayal I hadn't thought possible. He hadn't just enabled Madison's behavior, he'd committed serious crimes to fund it. Uncle Ryan helped me process the emotional impact of these discoveries. He explained that Dad's criminal behavior was likely driven by the same psychological factors that had created the family's dysfunction in the first place. Dad's desperate need for Madison to succeed had pushed him far beyond normal parental favoritism into criminal territory. His identity was so tied up in Madison's achievements that he'd been willing to destroy his business and betray his family to maintain the illusion of her success. But Mom's situation was more complex. Ryan believed that she'd been a victim of Dad's manipulation and intimidation, trapped in a system where questioning Madison or Dad's decisions brought immediate retaliation. Her years of silence weren't just weakness. They were a survival strategy in a household where speaking up led to emotional abuse and isolation. As the legal proceedings continued, more details emerged about the extent of Madison's deception. College board investigators discovered that she'd been selling fake test scores and fabricated transcripts to other students, turning her fraud into a profitable business. The IRS became involved when they realized she'd been earning unreported income from her criminal activities and hadn't paid taxes on any of it. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Madison showed classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder and had no genuine remorse for her actions. She continued to blame me for ruining her life and insisted that her fraud was justified because she deserved to go to Harvard more than students who'd earned their admission honestly. Even facing serious criminal charges, she remained convinced that she was the victim in the situation. 3 weeks after I'd left home, Mom finally found the courage to file for divorce. In her court filings, she detailed years of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and intimidation that had made her afraid to speak up about Madison's behavior or Dad's increasingly criminal activities. She admitted that watching Dad destroy my relationship with the family while enabling Madison's lies had finally given her the motivation to escape the toxic situation herself. The divorce proceedings revealed even more financial crimes. Dad had been forging Mom's signature on business documents, using her credit to secure loans for his embezzlement schemes, and had even taken out a second mortgage on their house without her knowledge. Mom's decision to leave wasn't just about the family dynamics anymore. It was about escaping financial ruin and potential criminal liability for crimes she hadn't committed. As I watched my family's world collapse from the safety of Ryan's guest room, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. I'd never wanted to destroy anyone's life, but I also couldn't ignore the relief I felt at finally being free from their manipulation and abuse. The scared kid, who'd always apologized for things he didn't do, was being replaced by a young man who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is let them face the consequences of their choices. 2 months after leaving home, my new life with Ryan had settled into a comfortable routine that felt more stable than anything I'd experienced growing up. I'd been promoted to senior account manager at my marketing firm after successfully handling several high-profile campaigns while working remotely. My boss was so impressed with my performance during the family crisis that she'd offered me a substantial raise and the flexibility to continue working partly from home. I'd also enrolled in a master's degree program in business administration, using the money I'd saved from my real college fund, the one my parents had never known about. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions based on my own goals and interests, rather than trying to avoid conflict or gain approval from people who would never be satisfied with my achievements. Meanwhile, the legal consequences for my family continued to escalate. Dad had been formally charged with embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion related to his systematic theft from the business. His assets had been seized to pay restitution to the clients and business partners he'd stolen from, and he was facing up to 15 years in federal prison. The prestigious contracting business he'd spent 20 years building was bankrupt and permanently closed. Madison faced an even broader range of charges. In addition to the testing fraud, she was being prosecuted for identity theft, mail fraud, and running what prosecutors called an organized criminal enterprise related to her sale of fake academic credentials to other students. The investigation had uncovered evidence that she'd made over $50,000 selling fraudulent test scores and transcripts over a 2-year period, money she'd spent on designer clothes and luxury vacations while claiming to be a struggling student. The psychological evaluation, ordered by Madison's defense team, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of providing grounds for a reduced sentence, it revealed a pattern of manipulative behavior and complete lack of empathy that prosecutors argued made her a danger to society. The court-appointed psychiatrist concluded that Madison had likely been manipulating and deceiving people since childhood, and that her fraud schemes were just the natural progression of a lifetime of lies. Most shocking to me was learning about the broader impact of Madison's crimes. 3 other students who'd purchased fake credentials from her had lost their college admissions and were facing their own criminal charges. A high school guidance counselor had been fired for accepting bribes to provide false recommendation letters. Even the family friend who'd provided fake employment verification for Madison was being investigated for fraud. The ripple effects extended into our community as well. Property values in our neighborhood dropped significantly as the scandal attracted negative media attention. Parents at Madison's former high school demanded investigations into whether other students had been involved in similar schemes. The private college consulting firm that had helped Madison fabricate her application materials lost their accreditation and faced multiple lawsuits from families who'd paid for legitimate services. But it was Mom's transformation that surprised me the most. Free from Dad's intimidation and financial pressure, she'd found work as a substitute teacher and was slowly rebuilding her life in a small apartment across town. Through Ryan, she'd sent me a letter taking full responsibility for her years of silence and expressing genuine pride in my decision to expose the truth despite the personal cost. Her letter was honest about the psychological abuse she'd endured and how Dad's threats had made her afraid to stand up for me or question Madison's behavior. But she didn't use that explanation as an excuse. Instead, she acknowledged that her silence had enabled years of injustice, and that I'd had every right to protect myself by leaving and exposing the truth. Reading her letter, I realized that Mom's transformation was probably only possible because the system of lies and manipulation that had trapped us all had finally collapsed. As long as Dad controlled the family narrative, and Madison's success validated his parenting, Mom had no safe way to speak the truth. But once the criminal investigations started and the facade crumbled, she'd finally been free to acknowledge reality and make different choices. The broader investigation had also revealed how common these types of college admissions scandals were becoming. Madison's case was part of a national trend of wealthy families using fraud and bribery to game the system, and federal prosecutors were cracking down hard to send a message that this behavior wouldn't be tolerated. The judge in Madison's case had specifically mentioned that lenient sentences in previous cases had only encouraged more fraud, and that she was determined to impose punishments that would actually deter future crimes. As I watched the news coverage of my family's downfall, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served and validation that my decision to speak up had been the right one. But there was also sadness for the family we might have been if my parents had been capable of treating their children fairly and honestly. Ryan helped me understand that my sadness was normal and healthy. He pointed out that I was mourning the loss of the family I'd always hoped for, not necessarily the family I'd actually had. The parents who could have loved me unconditionally and treated me fairly had never really existed except in my imagination, and accepting that loss was part of moving forward. But just as I was starting to feel like the worst of the drama was behind us, Madison made one final attempt at manipulation that would prove to be her biggest mistake yet. Through a mutual friend from high school, she reached out asking to meet with me privately. She claimed she wanted to apologize and make amends, but her real agenda was very different from what she'd promised. The meeting Madison requested took place at a neutral coffee shop downtown, with the mutual friend serving as an intermediary. I'd agreed to meet only because I wanted closure, and hoped that facing serious criminal charges might have finally forced Madison to confront reality. Ryan had advised me to record the conversation, both for my own protection and because Madison's history of manipulation made it likely she'd try to twist whatever was said. Madison arrived 20 minutes late, looking dramatically different from the polished, confident person I'd grown up with. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by generic jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back hastily, and she had dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but that sympathy evaporated the moment she started talking. Instead of the apology she'd promised, Madison immediately launched into a litany of accusations and demands. She blamed me for destroying her life out of jealousy and spite, insisted that her fraud was no big deal compared to what other students were doing, and demanded that I retract my statements to investigators and claim I'd made everything up. When I refused, Madison's mask slipped completely. She threatened to hurt herself if I didn't help her escape the consequences of her actions, claiming that her suicide would be my fault because I'd driven her to it with my accusations. She alternated between tears and rage, sometimes within the same sentence, trying every manipulation tactic she'd used successfully throughout our childhood. But the most revealing moment came when I asked her directly whether she felt any remorse for the students whose opportunities she'd stolen, or the family members she'd manipulated and lied to for years. Madison's response was chilling in its honesty. She said that everyone else was just collateral damage in her pursuit of success, and that she didn't owe anyone an apology for being smarter and more ambitious than they were. She admitted to all the fraud, not as a confession, but as a boast. Madison was actually proud of how elaborate her schemes had been and how long she'd gotten away with them. She seemed to view the criminal charges as an unfair punishment for being caught, not as appropriate consequences for serious crimes. In her mind, the problem wasn't what she'd done, but that I'd been disloyal enough to expose her. The conversation took an even darker turn when Madison started making threats against me personally. She claimed that she had information that could destroy my career and relationships, though she was vague about what that information might be. When I pointed out that I'd never done anything illegal or unethical, she laughed and said that the truth didn't matter as long as people believed her story. But Madison's biggest mistake was admitting that she'd been planning to frame me for some of her crimes if she couldn't convince me to help her. She'd been prepared to claim that I was actually the mastermind behind the fraud schemes, and that she'd been manipulated into participating by her abusive older brother. She'd even created fake evidence to support this narrative, including forged emails and edited photos that made it look like I'd been involved in her criminal activities. The recording I'd made of this conversation became the final piece of evidence that destroyed any remaining sympathy Madison might have had from prosecutors, judges, or the public. Her admission that she was willing to frame her own brother for crimes he'd never committed, combined with her complete lack of remorse for the actual victims of her fraud, painted a picture of someone who was genuinely dangerous to society. When I turned the recording over to federal prosecutors, they immediately upgraded Madison's charges to include attempted obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. Her defense team, which had been trying to negotiate a plea deal based on claims that she was a troubled young person who'd made mistakes, withdrew from the case after hearing the recording. No reputable lawyer wanted to be associated with defending someone who'd been caught red-handed trying to frame an innocent person for her own crimes. Dad's reaction to the recording was equally revealing. Instead of being horrified that his daughter had tried to frame his son, he was angry with me for entrapping Madison and making her look bad. Even facing his own criminal charges and financial ruin, he couldn't acknowledge that Madison's behavior was wrong, or that I'd been justified in protecting myself from her manipulation. His continued defense of Madison, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of her crimes and cruelty, finally helped me understand that Dad's favoritism had never been based on Madison's actual achievements or character. It had been about his own psychological needs and his inability to see his children as separate individuals rather than extensions of himself. Madison's success had made him feel successful, so he'd been willing to ignore or enable any behavior that maintained that illusion. But the recording also had an unexpected positive consequence. Within days of its release to prosecutors, I received a call from an executive recruiter who'd been following my family's case in the news. She represented a major consulting firm that was impressed with how I'd handled an impossible situation with integrity and courage. They were offering me a position in their executive training program with a starting salary that was higher than Dad's annual income had ever been. The irony wasn't lost on me that Madison's final attempt to destroy my life had actually led to the best career opportunity I'd ever been offered. Her manipulation and threats had backfired so completely that she'd essentially provided evidence of her own moral bankruptcy while highlighting my character and resilience to potential employers. As I sat in Ryan's living room that evening, reviewing the job offer and reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed, I realized that Madison's failed manipulation attempt had given me something I'd been seeking for years: absolute clarity about who she really was and what our family dynamic had actually been about. There was no more room for doubt or self-blame. I'd made the right choice in exposing the truth, and the consequences that followed were entirely the result of their own actions, not mine. 1 year after leaving my family's house with 2 trash bags and a determination to tell the truth, I was sitting in my new corner office overlooking downtown Hartford, Connecticut. The executive training program had exceeded all my expectations, and I'd been promoted to senior consultant faster than anyone in the company's history. My starting bonus alone was more than Dad had ever made in a single year, and I was using part of it for something I'd never thought possible: establishing a scholarship fund for students from dysfunctional families who needed financial support to escape toxic situations. The legal proceedings had finally concluded with results that exceeded even the prosecutor's expectations. Dad had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud, with orders to pay full restitution to his victims. The family's house and remaining assets had been sold to cover the debts, leaving him with nothing but a lengthy prison term and a permanent criminal record. Madison had received an even harsher sentence. If 15 years in federal prison for running what the judge called a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to defraud educational institutions and steal opportunities from honest students. The attempted frame job against me had been the deciding factor in her sentence, with the judge noting that her willingness to destroy an innocent person's life to escape consequences showed she posed a continuing danger to society. But the most meaningful resolution came from an unexpected source. 6 months after the trials ended, I received a letter from Mom that changed everything between us. She'd been working with a therapist to understand her own role in the family's dysfunction, and her letter was a genuine reckoning with years of choices that had enabled abuse and manipulation. She didn't ask for forgiveness or make excuses for her silence. Instead, she took complete responsibility for failing to protect me from Dad's favoritism and Madison's cruelty. She acknowledged that her fear of confrontation had made her complicit in years of emotional abuse, and that I'd been forced to protect myself in ways that no child should ever have to do. But the letter also included something I'd never expected: pride. Mom wrote that watching me handle the entire situation with integrity and courage had shown her what real strength looked like. She said that my decision to expose the truth, despite knowing it would destroy the family's facade, was the bravest thing she'd ever seen anyone do. For the first time in my life, I felt like at least one of my parents actually saw me for who I really was. I decided to respond to her letter, beginning what would become a cautious but genuine relationship built on honesty rather than obligation. We started meeting for coffee once a month, conversations that were sometimes difficult but always real. Mom was working hard to understand and change the patterns that had made her unable to stand up for me when it mattered most. She'd found work as a full-time teacher and was living modestly but peacefully in her small apartment. For the first time in her adult life, she was making decisions based on her own values, rather than fear of someone else's reaction. She'd started speaking up when she witnessed injustice, even in small situations, as practice for the courage she wished she'd had when I was growing up. Uncle Ryan had become the father figure I'd never had, offering guidance and support without the strings and conditions that had defined my relationship with Dad. He helped me understand that choosing to have a relationship with Mom didn't mean I had to forgive Dad or Madison, and that I had every right to maintain boundaries that protected my emotional well-being. The scholarship fund I'd established had grown beyond my initial vision, partly because my story had inspired other people who'd escaped dysfunctional families to contribute. We were providing not just financial support, but mentoring and counseling services to help young people navigate the complex emotions of breaking free from toxic family systems. One of our first scholarship recipients was a 19-year-old named Sarah, whose situation reminded me painfully of my own. Her parents had been stealing her wages from a part-time job to fund her brother's gambling addiction, and she'd finally found the courage to move out and report the theft. Helping her navigate college applications and financial aid, while dealing with family retaliation, felt like giving someone else the support I'd wished for during my own escape. Working with these students had taught me something important about the nature of family loyalty. Real loyalty doesn't mean protecting people from the consequences of their harmful actions. It means caring enough about their long-term well-being to hold them accountable when they're destroying themselves and others. My decision to expose Madison's fraud wasn't an act of betrayal. It was an attempt to stop a destructive pattern before it caused even more damage. The success of my new career had also given me perspective on Dad's obsession with Madison's achievements. I realized that his need for her to succeed had never been about her potential or happiness. It had been about his own insecurity and his desperate need to feel like a successful parent. My quieter, more sustainable accomplishments had never fed his ego the way Madison's dramatic but hollow victories had. But perhaps the most important lesson I'd learned was about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I'd forgiven my parents and Madison in the sense that I'd stopped carrying anger about their treatment of me. That anger had been poisoning my own life and preventing me from moving forward. But forgiveness didn't mean I had to restore relationships that had been built on manipulation and abuse. Madison had written to me several times from prison, letters that alternated between fake apologies and continued attempts at manipulation. I'd stopped reading them after the first few, recognizing that she was still trying to control the narrative and avoid taking real responsibility for her actions. Some people can change when faced with consequences, but others simply become more sophisticated in their manipulation tactics. The life lesson that emerged from this entire experience was both simple and profound. Walking away from toxic family isn't abandonment, it's self-preservation. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give people is letting them face the consequences of their choices without cushioning the impact or enabling their continued dysfunction. True family supports your growth and celebrates your achievements without condition. Real parents want their children to develop integrity and resilience, not just the appearance of success. And genuine sibling relationships are built on mutual respect and support, not competition and manipulation. As I looked out my office window at the city below, I felt something I'd never experienced growing up: Peace. I was finally living a life based on my own values and goals, surrounded by people who valued honesty and growth over appearances and control. The scared kid, who'd always apologized for things he didn't do, had become a confident young man who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction. My story had also become an inspiration to others facing similar situations. I'd received dozens of letters from people who'd found the courage to leave toxic families or report fraud after hearing about my experience. Knowing that my decision to speak the truth had helped other people protect themselves made every difficult moment of the past year worthwhile. The scholarship fund continued to grow, and I was planning to expand it nationally within the next 2 years. My career was thriving beyond my wildest expectations, and I'd found a sense of purpose in helping other people escape situations similar to what I'd endured. Most importantly, I'd learned that building a life based on integrity and truth, even when it's initially painful, creates a foundation for lasting happiness that can't be shaken by other people's dysfunction or manipulation. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where speaking the truth meant losing relationships that were important to you, but staying silent meant betraying your own values? Sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones that force us to choose between keeping the peace and doing what's right, but those moments often define who we really are and what kind of life we want to build. If my story resonates with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between family loyalty and personal integrity? I'd love to hear about your experiences and how you navigated those challenging situations. Don't forget to like this video if it helped you think about family dynamics in a new way, and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in difficult circumstances. Sharing this video might help someone else who's struggling with similar decisions realize they're not alone, and that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Thank you for listening to my story and for taking the time to think about these important questions. I hope that whatever challenges you're facing in your own family relationships, you'll find the courage to prioritize your well-being and surround yourself with people who genuinely support your growth and happiness.